Chapter 1. Blood on the Stone. The drums accelerated. Ara watched the water settle back to stillness, her pulse loud in her ears. No one had seen, no one ever saw. She flexed her fingers under the surface, watching the tiny wound on her palm catch the amber lamplight. A razor-thin slice from the pot's rough edge, barely worth a breath of complaint. Kitchen girls bled and healed and bled again. It was not worth mentioning, but the water had not taken the blood. Ara pulled her hands from the basin, tucking them beneath her apron where no eye could wander. The stone at her back seeped cold through her thin shift, the same cold that lived in her bones, in the shape of her shoulders, in the way she made herself small enough to avoid notice. She had learned the trick of it young: become furniture, become shadow, become so still that eyes passed over like water over glass. The senior girl had already swept onward, her voice trailing behind her like a flag of war. Fenrir at the gates, the war beast walks. The words rippled through the kitchen staff in hushed currents, carrying fear and fascination in equal measure. Cooks paused over their stoves, porters forgot their burdens. Even Margot, who ruled this realm with wooden spoon and sharp tongue, had stopped her endless circuit to stare toward the palace's upper reaches. Ara knew the stories. Every kitchen girl did. Fenrir, the ancient guardian, appeared only when the bloodline was tested, when succession hung in balance or the realm faced annihilation. The last time had been 60 years ago, before Ara's mother was born, when the old king died and three claimants fought for the throne. The beast had chosen. The war ended in a single afternoon. What did it want now? The drums shifted again, the rhythm climbing toward something urgent. Ara counted the beats without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, 4, the way she counted everything in this place. Steps between stations, breaths between inspections. The seconds of silence that meant Margot was watching. Her hand throbbed. She pressed her palm harder against her stomach, feeling the warmth of her own skin, the slight stickiness where the blood had dried. The cut was nothing. The blood had been nothing. She repeated the words like a prayer, though her body knew something her mind refused to speak. You imagined it. The water was cold, the light was dim. You imagined it because you are tired and hungry and foolish, and you have been waiting your whole life for something to see you. But the drums did not lie. Something was waking. Something old and vast and bound by laws older than the palace stones. And in the space between one heartbeat and the next, Ara understood, with a certainty that had no source, that it had not come for the nobles in their high halls. The drums called. The blood answered. She stood motionless at her station, water dripping from her raised hands, waiting for the world to make sense again. It would not. It would never. She knew this the way she knew the layout of every corridor, the schedule of every patrol, the precise number of seconds she could linger near the warming ovens before someone noticed. The drums thundered on, the kitchen churned with whispers, and Ara, invisible as ever, held her cut palm to her chest and felt, for the first time, that being unseen might no longer be enough to keep her safe. The lower kitchens transformed each morning into something between a forge and a storm. Heat rose from a dozen hearths curling with the steam from enormous copper vats where oats simmered and cabbage wilted. The air hung thick, carrying the sharp bite of singed fat and the dull sweetness of overripe fruit destined for the evening puddings. Every surface glistened, every breath felt borrowed. Margot Irondale moved through it all like a warden conducting inspection, her steel-gray eyes cataloging inefficiencies with the flat efficiency of someone who had never questioned the system she enforced. Her footsteps preceded her by a half-second, the soft thwack of practical shoes on stone, the slight rustle of her uniform's stiff collar. The staff felt her approach the way animals feel weather changing, clear channels, sweep before you carry. The nobles' breakfast in 40 minutes, and I will not have their path sullied by the sight of your blundering. She stationed herself at the kitchen's heart where the central work table dominated like an altar. A clipboard hung from her belt, its pages dense with assignments written in her precise, angular hand. One by one, she dispatched the morning's duties: senior cooks to the bread ovens, porters to the cellar, scullery maids to the endless pile of copper that never diminished no matter how many hands scrubbed. Ara received hers without ceremony. Ash buckets from the ceremonial hearths, the ones in the upper corridor. You'll carry them to the waste yard, then return to scrub the grand hall's outer flagstones before the nobility arrives. Margot's gaze slid over Ara without pausing. Move quickly. The High Elder ceremony begins at noon, and the outer path must be clear before the procession forms. The words landed like stones. Haul, carry, scrub. Tasks designed to keep a body moving but never arriving anywhere that mattered. Ara nodded once, the smallest dip of her chin, and turned toward the ash buckets waiting near the servants' corridor. Primoris. The name stopped her. Margot had used her assigned name, the one given to kitchen cast-offs, the one that meant she had no family to claim her. It had been 3 days since Margot had spoken to her directly. That was the nature of being Omega, invisible, unworthy of correction. But Margot was already crossing the distance between them, her eyes fixed on Ara's chest. Your sash. Ara looked down. The twisted cloth at her waist, gray for Omega, for wolfless, for nothing, had come loose at one end. The knot had slipped, hanging 2 inches lower than protocol demanded. Rank marks must be visible at all times. Margot's fingers were already working the fabric, retying the knot with brisk, humiliating efficiency. Her knuckles brushed Ara's stomach once, twice, the touch clinical and cold. You represent the palace. Try to represent it without looking like a beggar who stole her clothes from a corpse. Other servants watched. Faces she recognized from years of sharing corridor space turned away just as quickly, not wanting to be caught looking. This was the hierarchy in miniature Omega, wolfless, unknown parentage. Found on the Blood Moon border as an infant, raised within the palace servant system with no name beyond what Margot had assigned her. No pack. No wolf. No claim to anything but the rags on her back and the work in her hands. The knot tightened. Margot stepped back, satisfied, and Ara felt the fabric settle against her hip proper, visible, marking her exactly as the system demanded. Move. Margot said, the ash won't carry itself. Ara moved. She learned young that survival in these halls required a particular geometry, not invisibility, that was impossible when bodies crowded every corridor, but something closer to water. She flowed into spaces without disturbing surfaces. She kept her elbows tucked, her pace measured, her voice absent unless directly addressed. The kitchen staff passed around her like current around stone, never quite touching, never quite seeing. The ash buckets were heavier than they looked. The ceremonial hearths burned different fuels, cedar and juniper, resins that left gray powder clinging to everything like ash of the gods themselves. Ara hauled the first bucket through the servant corridors, past the turning point where the walls narrowed and the ceiling pressed low, and out into the thin morning light of the waste yard. She allowed herself 30 seconds. There was a narrow slit window near the yard's entrance, cut into the stone for ventilation. It looked up, not down, up toward the grand hall's outer spire, toward the silver banners that snapped in the early wind. The Ceremonia Dua de Sanang, ancient sigils she could not read, characters that meant nothing to her formal education but everything to something deeper. Somewhere below her sternum, in a place she had no name for, they felt like a question being asked. What are you? The banners rippled. The drums from last night had fallen silent, but something else hummed beneath the palace's foundations, a vibration in the stones, a waiting. Ara did not wish to attend the ceremony. She did not wish to be seen by whatever ancient power had stirred in the night. She wished only to survive the day without drawing Margot's attention again, to scrub the flagstones clean, to haul the ash, to disappear into the geometry of her duties and emerge, at day's end, still breathing. She turned from the window. The corridor behind her had emptied, but movement caught her eye 2 junior priests in cream and silver robes, their faces bowed in conversation. Between them walked a figure she recognized from 100 whispered descriptions, Elric Silvermane, the High Elder. His white fur silvered with age, his ceremonial robes pooling around him like captured moonlight. They were passing through the adjacent corridor, heading toward the upper halls. Ara flattened herself against the wall. The practiced motion came automatically, shrink, compress, become less. Her breath slowed. Her eyes dropped to the stones. But Elric paused. It was only for a fraction of a second. His stooped posture shifted, his clouded pale eyes moving across the corridor toward her. The 2 priests continued walking unaware. And Elric stood there, his ancient face unreadable, his gaze snagging on her like fabric catching on a nail. Something flickered in his expression, not recognition, she had never been seen enough to be recognized, but something that preceded recognition, something like a question being asked for the first time. Then the moment passed. The priest called something to him and he turned, his silver-maned head dipping in acknowledgement, and continued down the corridor. Ara exhaled. The drums carried the heartbeat of the blood moon pack through stone and marrow. Ara felt them in her teeth as she moved along the service wall, her eyes fixed on the polished floor where her shadow stretched thin and dark behind her. The amphora pressed cold against her hip. Good wine, older than she'd ever tasted, meant for the altar of gods older than the palace itself. 12 feet. That's what remained between her and the altar table, between her and the completion of this task, between her and the quiet corridor that would carry her back to the kitchens and Margot's calculating gaze. She counted the feet without meaning to. 7, 6. Then the world stopped. The sound that left Fenrir's throat was not a growl, it was not a bark, it was a low, resonant frequency that bypassed her ears entirely and settled somewhere behind her sternum, in that nameless place where the ancient sigils on the banners had always called to her. The war beast turned impossibly large, impossibly black, his blue eyes catching torchlight like stars trapped in midnight water, and those eyes found her. Ara's hands went numb. The amphora slipped. She watched it fall in fragments of perfect, terrible clarity, the ceramic breaking, the wine bursting outward, the dark liquid spreading across the mirror-bright floor in a shape that looked impossibly like a map of something she didn't recognize. The sound of the shattering was enormous in the silence. Then nothing. Then only the absence of sound, as if the hall itself had stopped breathing. Fenrir lowered himself.
The war beast who had not knelt to any living wolf in 1,000 years, whose legend was carved in the bones of the old mountains, whose name was spoken only in times of war and sacred rite, Fenrir folded his massive forelegs beneath him and bowed his great head to the stone. His blue eyes never left her, the silence held. Ara stood in the center of it, wine soaking into the hem of her borrowed servant's dress, her lungs forgetting how to work. This was wrong. This was impossible. She had done something wrong. She must have, and now the ancient beast had seen it, had judged her, and this was the moment when the correction would come. She waited for Margot's voice, for the guards, for the sharp words that would send her back to the ash buckets where she belonged. They didn't come. Instead, she felt eyes, hundreds of them, thousands. The weight of them pressed against her skin like heat from a forge. She didn't need to look up to know who watched Killian's gold gaze from the dais, heavy with something she couldn't name, Elric's pale ancient eyes, the question in them sharp enough to cut Seraphina's ice-blue stare, cold and narrowing, the cold igniting into something far more dangerous than mere frost. Her feet knew what to do. 20 years of survival screamed the same instruction. Run. The service corridor was 12 steps behind her.
She could move, could disappear, could scrub the flagstones until her knuckles bled and pretend this never happened. She didn't move. Something pulled at her, a thread connected to that nameless place beneath her sternum, the place where the banner's sigils had always asked their unanswerable question. Fenrir's eyes held hers, and in them she saw not submission, not judgment, but recognition. As if he had been waiting, as if he had always known. One step forward, that was all. Her foot lifted from the wine-soaked stone and set down again, closer to the war beast, closer to whatever ancient answer waited in the space between them. Outside the palace walls, the drums fell silent. The walk took 30 seconds. It felt like crossing a continent. Ara moved across the hall floor, her bare feet silent on the stone that had witnessed 1,000 years of ritual. Every noble house watched, every council member, every warrior in ceremonial dress. The weight of their gazes pressed against her skin like heat from a forge, and she understood with sudden clarity that she had been seen for the first time in her life, not as background, not as servant, not as nothing, but as something that demanded attention. The torches burned higher without anyone touching them. She noticed this only because the cold had crept in without permission, breath visible in the air between her and the dais, frost creeping along the edges of the windows. The ancestral mural on the ceiling moved in her peripheral vision. She was certain of it, figures that had been still for centuries, shifting in some ancient story she couldn't read. Fenrir waited. His massive form seemed to fill the space between the altar and the dais, black fur absorbing light, blue eyes tracking her approach with an intensity that made her heart stutter. She stopped before him. Her cut palm throbbed, the same hand that had bled into the kitchen water that morning, the same hand that had slipped and shattered the amphora. Without understanding why, she raised it. The contact was electric. The bridge of his enormous head was warm beneath her palm, warmer than blood, warmer than fire. And then the awakening crashed through her like a tide breaking through a dam that had held for 20 years. Images that were not memories but felt older than memory flooded her senses. Ancient wolves the size of mountains moving across a sky full of stars, a bloodline traced in silver light, a name in a language that predated writing that she somehow understood, and the understanding irrevocable, undeniable, that she was not the last of something. She was the return of it. The armor came next. Light first, silver white, blazing from within, and then the plates assembled across her shoulders and chest as if they had always been there, waiting. Rune-etched silver caught the torchlight, shimmered, settled. She looked down at her hands and saw them armored in the same luminous metal, felt the weight of it like a second skin. Her eyes shifted, she felt it happen, the change from brown to pale blue, luminous, the same blue as Fenrir's, the same blue as the stars in her impossible vision. The hall erupted. Nobles stumbled backward, voices rising in a tide of shock and disbelief. Warriors reached for weapons they did not draw, some instinct staying their hands, some ancient memory deeper than thought. A woman's sharp cry cut through the noise. Ara didn't need to look to know it wasn't for her. Serafina gripped the arm of Councilman Vinus beside her. Her face was a controlled mask, but her fingers, Ara caught a glimpse, dug into fabric hard enough to whiten her knuckles. Ice-blue eyes burned with something far more dangerous than mere frost. Killian moved. He was the only person in the hall who did not step back. He stepped forward instead, his gold gaze fixed on her with the focused intensity of a man cataloging the impossible and choosing, deliberately, to accept it. He crossed to the edge of the dais and looked down at the kitchen girl in primordial armor, blue-eyed and trembling, one hand still pressed to Fenrir's head. His voice, when it came, was formal. The language of blood rites, the old tongue that hadn't been spoken in full ceremony for generations. The beast recognizes, the old blood answers. The rite stands witness. The words settled into the silence like stones into still water. Ara felt them land in her chest, felt them change something fundamental. These were words that could not be unsaid once spoken in the grand hall. Behind Killian, Elric moved. The High Elder sank to one knee on the dais steps, his ancient face wet with something that might have been tears or might have been light from the new torches. His voice whispered across the silence, audible only because the hall had gone utterly still. The primordial line has returned. Ara's breath caught, the weight of it pressed down on her. Not just the armor, not just the eyes, not just the ancient beast beneath her palm, but the knowledge that followed hard on its heels. She could not undo the awakening, she could not unspeak the recognition, she could not unhear Killian's words or unsee Elric's knee on the stone. She was no longer invisible. She was, whether prepared or not, the most politically dangerous person in the Blood Moon realm. The thought landed in her mind with the cold clarity of the new air around her, and she understood with sudden urgency that she would need to understand what she was before others decided to define it for her. Chapter 2: The Ceremony. Rewritten. The antechamber swallowed the chaos of the grand hall behind its carved door. Stone walls lined with scrolls and preserved wolf pelts held the quiet like a breath. A single fire burned low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. Ara sat on a stone bench, her hands trembling in her lap. The armor still glowed faintly, silver-white runes catching the firelight, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. She had not moved from this position since the guards had escorted her here. She did not know what else to do. Fenrir lay at her feet. The great beast had folded himself into a space that should have been too small, his black fur absorbing the firelight, his blue eyes half-lidded. There was something settled in his posture, something complete, like a creature that had run a great distance and finally reached home. Elric Silvermane sat across from her on a wooden chair that creaked beneath his slight weight. The High Elder had not spoken for several minutes, and when he finally did, his voice carried the weight of a man delivering news he had rehearsed for centuries without knowing his audience. The primordial line, he began, was not born from the great houses. It preceded them. The first wolves walked before thrones existed, before borders were drawn, before the Blood Moon Pact sealed the old families into their separate territories. Ara listened. Every word dismantled something inside her, a wall she had built brick by brick over 20 years of invisibility. She did not ask grand questions. She asked the only ones that made sense. Why did no one know? Elric's pale eyes flickered. The line was hunted during the Wars of Binding. Those who carried the blood were hidden, scattered to the border territories, their heritage buried beneath new names and lower stations. The great houses believed the blood extinguished. It was safer that way? Why was I left? The words came out smaller than she intended, abandoned on the blood moon border as an infant, raised in kitchens, kept invisible. You were not left. You were hidden. The last daughter of a hidden line, placed where she would be overlooked until the blood called itself home. She looked at her armored hands. What does this mean for tomorrow? Before Elric could answer, the door opened. Killian entered without announcement. The room rearranged itself around his presence. Elric straightened on his chair. Fenrir lifted his head. The king moved to the fire and stood with his back to it, facing Ara. Authority clung to him like a garment, not performed but inherent. The ceremony cannot be unmade, he said. Fenrir's recognition is law older than the council. By dawn, every noble house in the realm will know what happened in this hall tonight. They will demand answers.
They will also demand blood, yours or mine, depending on who speaks first.
Ara met his gold gaze. What are you going to do? I am asking you.
He stepped closer, his boots silent on the stone. Who are you? The question hung between them, not rhetorical, not accusatory, genuine. She considered the question, the honest answer, the only one she had.
I don't know yet.
Killian nodded. Something shifted in his expression, something that might have been respect or might have been recognition of a kindred displacement. You have until dawn to decide what you intend to do with what you are. He turned and moved toward the door. Rest here. You will need your strength. The door closed behind him. Ara sat in the silence that followed. She looked down at Fenrir. The great beast looked back at her, blue eyes ancient and patient, waiting. The first fragile thread of the bond settled around her like a second skin. The grand hall had transformed overnight. Servants had cleared the ceremonial debris and arranged long tables in a crescent facing the dais, where Killian's throne stood alone. Daylight poured through the high windows, catching the dust motes drifting through the air and turning them to gold. Ara had been escorted to a seat at the chamber's edge, a chair placed deliberately apart from the noble houses, close enough to witness, far enough to suggest she did not belong. She wore simple garments now, her armor dissolved back into whatever void had summoned it. Without the silver-white shell, she felt exposed, visible in a way that made her skin crawl. Every seat was filled. The great houses sat in ordered rows, their colors sharp against the stone-deep greens, burnished golds, the midnight blue of the northern clans. Councilman Vinus occupied the front bench, his silver-streaked hair combed precisely, his hands folded on the table before him. He had not looked at Ara once since she entered. Seraphina rose. The Lady Vinus had changed into crimson, a color that demanded attention, that left no room for misunderstanding. Her platinum hair was swept high, her ice-blue eyes taking inventory of the assembly with the precision of a general surveying a battlefield. She did not shout, she did not perform. The primordial line, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall, is a story, preserved in oral tradition, cited in exactly one scroll of disputed authenticity. It has no genealogical record, no pack affiliation, no council-recognized name. She paused, letting the words settle. The girl in question was, until yesterday, a kitchen servant. She has no documented lineage, no standing. Fenrir's behavior, however dramatic, cannot override centuries of established law. The murmur that followed was not approval or dissent. It was the sound of the council processing, calculating, repositioning. Ara watched faces shift, watched eyes flick between Seraphina and the empty throne. Pimsanas rose to his feet. My daughter speaks for the Vinus house. The claims she makes are consistent with the council's own records. We formally support her position. Two additional council members voiced agreement. The numbers were small but growing. Elric Silvermane stood, his aged frame drawing attention. The High Elder's records adamantwell. The ceremonial authority, Seraphina cut in smoothly, does not extend to governance. The council governs. The elder presides over ritual. The distinction is established in the charter of the second moon. She inclined her head, not disrespectfully, but with the finality of a door closing. With respect, elder, your precedent is noted but not binding. Elric's jaw tightened. He sat. Ara understood what was happening. Serafina had not screamed or thrown accusations. She had built a cage out of procedure, out of documentation, out of the careful architecture of power that kept people like Ara in their places. If the council ruled that the primordial line was myth, Ara would return to the kitchens. The awakening would be classified as a ceremonial irregularity, an anomaly, a story to tell in whispers. She would have no mechanism to refuse. Killian had not spoken. He sat on his throne, still and watchful, his gold eyes tracking the assembly. The morning light caught the silver threading in his ceremonial blacks, but his face remained unreadable. Serafina concluded, "We request the council dismiss this matter as unverified and return the subject to her assigned duties." The silence stretched, then Killian stood. The hall rearranged itself around him, not physically, but in attention, in the gravitational pull of authority. He descended the steps of the dais slowly, each footfall deliberate, until he stood at the center of the crescent. He spoke. The words were not in the common tongue. They were older, guttural, resonant, the language of the ancients, the tongue of the first wolves. The sounds crawled up Ara's spine and settled at the base of her skull, warm and electric. She did not understand the words, but her body understood them. Her blood answered. He spoke the blood-right acknowledgement, the formal declaration. The words he had spoken in the hall the previous night, repeated now in full assembly in the language that predated law. The hall held its breath. Serafina's composure did not crack, her spine remained straight, her expression calm. But her hands, resting on the arm of her chair, closed slowly around the wood. She had won the argument. Every point she made was valid within the system she had cited. But Killian had not argued the legal question. He had moved the contest to a plane where her council books had no jurisdiction. The silence was absolute. Ara watched him, this king who had spoken an ancient declaration on her behalf, who had staked his authority on a recognition that no document could verify. He was not protecting her. She understood that now. He was acknowledging her. The distinction settled into her chest like a second heartbeat. The archives smelled of cedar and thyme. Elric produced a key that looked older than his grandfather's grandfather, its teeth worn smooth by centuries of secrecy. The lock yielded with a sigh, and the door swung inward to reveal a chamber no larger than a storeroom. But its walls were lined with scrolls, their spines cracked and faded, their vellum yellowed to the color of old bone.
"These predate the pact," Elric said, his voice hushed. "The Blood Moon Compact was written to codify what already existed. The first wolves did not conquer. They were recognized." Era reached for a scroll, hesitant. The paper felt fragile beneath her fingers, like it might dissolve into dust if she breathed too hard. "The covenant," Elric continued, settling into a chair that creaked under his weight, "was not between wolves. It was between wolves and the old magic. The magic chose, not the other way around." The afternoon light through the narrow windows turned to gold, then amber, then gray. Era read. She learned that the primordial line carried the covenant in their blood, not as a metaphor, but as literal truth. The sovereignty was not earned, it was inherent. The first wolves had not seized power, had recognized them and answered. Her entire life she had believed herself to be nothing, a mistake, an oversight. The universe's judgment rendered in threadbare clothes and ash buckets. She had survived by making herself small, invisible, harmless. But she had been wrong.
The realization did not bloom like a flower. It cracked through her like ice on a frozen lake, jagged and cold and impossible to ignore. Elric watched her read. He did not fill the silence with comfort or explanation. He let the words do their work, his pale eyes patient, his old hands folded in his lap. On the second day, Killian came. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, saying nothing. Ara felt his presence before she saw him, the weight of his attention, the subtle shift in the room's chia. She looked up from a scroll detailing the first binding. He watched her. Not the scroll, not Elric. Her. Then he crossed to the table, placed a second lamp beside the one already burning, and left. His footsteps echoed down the stone corridor until the silence returned. Ara stared at the lamp. The new flame. She said nothing. Across the palace, Serafina moved. She visited Councilman Morin at his private residence. She petitioned for a formal genealogical review, her voice calm, her arguments precise. She spoke to allies in the merchant houses, reframing Killian's declaration as emotional impulse rather than legal precedent. The Vinus name carried weight. She intended to use it. The servants whispered. News traveled through the kitchens like water through cracks. Margot heard it all.
She appeared at the archive door on the second evening. Ara looked up from a scroll detailing the third reckoning. Margot stood in the doorway, her steel-gray eyes fixed on the Omega who had scrubbed her pots, who had tightened her sash and made her feel small. Ara met her gaze steadily. She did not look away. Margot opened her mouth, then closed it. Her jaw worked silently. She turned and left, her footsteps quick, her structural certainty crumbling with every step. By the second night, Ara understood. She could not be invisible and sovereign. The old magic had not chosen a servant, it had chosen a queen, or what remained of one. The scrolls spoke of the covenant, of blood that answered blood, of recognition that transcended law. She had spent 20 years making herself unseen. Now the world insisted on seeing her. The scroll in her hands trembled slightly, not from age, from her. The iron in her chest sat heavy, immovable, true. The grand hall had transformed. Rune torches lined the walls, their flames burning steady and white rather than the usual amber. Above, the ancestral mural moved figures in the ancient painting turning their heads, painted eyes tracking the proceedings below. The assembly was smaller tonight. Nobility and council only. No servants. No witnesses beyond those who held power. Ara stood at the hall's edge, where protocol had placed her. She was still learning where she belonged in space. The position felt wrong, too far from the dais, too visible, too exposed. But she stood there anyway, her hands clasped before her, her face betraying nothing. Killian rose from his throne. The Ceremonia Dua de Senang will not be voided, he said, his voice carrying through the hall. It will be altered. The silence that followed was absolute. Ara watched the faces of the noble houses. Shock, calculation, fear, fury. They knew what he proposed was unprecedented. The ceremony had not been changed in 1,000 years. Elric stepped forward, a scroll unfurled in his hands. His voice carried the weight of centuries as he read aloud the founding text of the Blood Moon Pact, a provision no one had needed to invoke since the first binding. Should the primordial line return, the blood rites are to be completed under its authority, not the reigning monarchs alone. Seraphina stood, her voice cut through the hall like a blade. This proceeding lacks genealogical verification. The council has not— Whoa! The council will recognize what the beast has already recognized, Killian said. His tone was calm, final. The blood rite proceeds as the pact dictates. Seraphina's jaw tightened. She sat. Killian turned. His gold eyes found Ara across the distance of the hall, that same 30-second walk she had made once before when Fenrir first bowed to her. But this time he was not watching her come, he was waiting. The ritual blade lay on the ceremonial table, its edge catching the white light of the rune torches. Killian lifted it, extended it across the distance between them. Handle first, not handed to her. Offered. An invitation. A question. Ara's breath caught. She crossed the hall. The walk felt longer this time. The noble houses watched. Councilman Venus's face had gone pale. Seraphina's ice-blue eyes tracked Ara's movement like a predator tracking prey. But Ara did not look at them. She looked at Killian, his steady gaze, the set of his jaw, the way he held the blade as though it weighed nothing at all. She reached him, took the blade. The handle was cold against her palm. She drew it across her own hand, a quick, clean cut. Blood welled dark and red against her skin. The old magic responded instantaneously. The rune torches flared white, blazing so bright that several nobles raised their arms to shield their eyes. The ancestral mural overhead shifted, the painted figures turning their faces downward, witnessing. Silver-white armor assembled on Ara's body, rune-etched and gleaming, and her eyes burned pale blue, matching the fire that now filled the hall. Fenrir rose from his position at the dais's base and moved to stand at Ara's left shoulder. His presence was warm, solid, real, a shield, a partner. Killian extended his palm. Ara placed the blade in his hand and he drew it across his own skin, his expression unchanged, as though the pain meant nothing at all. Then he pressed his bleeding palm to hers. The blood covenant joined them, not king to subject, sovereign to sovereign.
The old magic sealed it, and the hall felt the shift in the air like a change in atmospheric pressure, a weight lifting, a new order settling into place. Ara felt herself change with it. She was no longer reacting, no longer surviving. she was conducting. The reactive phase of her story ended here, in blood and torchlight, with Killian's hand closed around hers and Fenrir's warmth at her shoulder. Across the hall, Seraphina watched. In the instant before she composed her expression, before the mask of calculated composure slipped back into place, something crossed her face that was not quite anger and not quite fear. It was the look of someone who had just understood that the game had changed at a level beyond her ability to contest. The morning light fell gray through the eastern windows. Ara walked the corridor alone, Fenrir moving silent at her shoulder, and pushed open the oak doors to the War Council chamber. The men around the table looked up. 5 counselors, all older, all with the careful faces of people recalibrating. The secondary chair had always been empty before, a seat for visitors, for supplicants. Ara pulled it out and sat. The silence stretched. Someone cleared his throat. "The Eastern Border reports," she said. Not a question. Not a request. A demand laid plain.
Councilman Marin exchanged a glance with his neighbor. The matter is under review of 3 weeks of unusual movement. Ara's voice carried the weight of the armor still faintly luminous beneath her sleeves. Old families who swore fealty to a rival claim, a force of wolves who do not recognize the current pact. You've been managing these reports quietly. Marin's mouth thinned. We did not wish to destabilize the ceremonial period. The ceremonial period is concluded. Ara folded her hands on the table. The eastern border is not. Killian watched from his place at the head of the table. His gold eyes tracked her like a man watching something he had expected to grow instead bloom fully formed. He had prepared to guide her through the first weeks. He had not prepared for her to walk into this room and take command of its language. Marin, Killian said quietly. The reports. Marin unfolded a map pinned with iron markers. The eastern frontier spread across the Wood River crossings, watchtower positions, the thin line where Blood Moon territory met the old disputed lands. Ara studied it without blinking. Over the following days, she returned to the chamber. She asked questions that made the counselors pause, gaps in their strategic thinking she uncovered with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime observing what others missed. She cross-referenced Elric's teachings about the Primordial Pact's original territory agreements against the current maps, and slowly, a picture formed. They want the old boundary stones reinstated, she said on the 4th day, her finger tracing a line across the map. Not conquest, restoration. Elric stood at her shoulder, translating old law into present applicability. He had become her shadow, her scholar. His hesitation dissolved into something that looked almost like reverence. He had waited centuries for a student who could hear what the scrolls actually said. Seraphina made her final move on the 6th day. A genealogical petition filed with the council's legal body demanding documented proof before the blood covenant held weight, her last tool within the system. Killian responded by commissioning Elric to retrieve the founding scroll, to be formally witnessed. 10 days the legal process would take. 10 days for the eastern border reports to worsen. Smoke appeared in the tree line on the 8th day, visible from the chamber windows. Through those 10 days, Ara and Killian governed beside each other. They disagreed twice, once on troop positioning, once on whether to send envoys, and resolved both disagreements without either deferring. It was practice, it was partnership, it was the first fragile, unspoken layer of something neither had language for yet, built not through declaration, but through the daily work of standing at the same table, facing the same map, sharing the same silence when the reports grew worse. The gray dawn brought 3 riders. Ira heard them before she saw them. The thunder of hooves on the eastern road, the sharp bark of commands, the particular urgency of wolves who had pushed their mounts past exhaustion. She was already in the War Council chamber when they arrived, the map still spread across the table, her finger still resting on the old boundary stones. 3 men staggered through the doors. Their cloaks were torn, their horses lathered in white foam. The lead rider clutched a cylinder of sealed leather to his chest like a man holding his own heart. "From Captain Thorne," he gasped, dropping to one knee. "The Eastern Force is not a patrol. It is not a probe. It is an army." Councilman Marin took the cylinder with hands that did not quite tremble. He broke the seal, unrolled the parchment, and read. His face went the color of old ash. 3,000, he said quietly, moving under the sigil of the Ashenmaw clan. The name moved through the chamber like a cold draft. The Ashenmaw, a pre-pact wolf clan, older than the Blood Moon Compact itself, once governed by the primordial line before the first kings consolidated power. They had faded into legend, into border raids, into whispered stories about the old days. An army of 3,000 was not legend, it was annihilation. They carry a message. Marin's voice had flattened into something worse than fear. He read aloud, the old tongue rolling unfamiliar and sharp from his tongue. To the heir of the primordial line, the covenant was broken, the old boundaries were forgotten. We have waited, we have watched, now we come, recognize the ancient pact, or we will honor it through conquest. The choice is yours. The chamber erupted, voices overlapped, demands for explanation, accusations, questions about troop positions and defensive lines. Aram remained still. Her hand had not moved from the map. Clear the room. Killian's voice cut through the noise like a blade. The counselors fell silent. All of you. Now. They filed out reluctantly, shooting glances at Ara that ranged from suspicion to something that might have been fear. Sarafina remained in the doorway, her white gown stark against the gray light.
The kitchen girl has brought war to our gates.
Her voice was soft, precise, surgical. She did not look at Killian when she said it. She looked at Ara.
Perhaps the council should reconsider whether the council will do nothing.
Killian's gold eyes were fixed on the message in Marin's hand. Leave us. Sarafina's jaw tightened. She swept out without another word, her footsteps echoing in the corridor. The doors closed. Silence pooled in the chamber like water in a basin. Ara picked up the message. She read it again, her eyes moving slowly over the old tongue script. Then she set it down. They're not coming because of me, she said quietly. Her voice did not waver. They're coming because no one honored the covenant when they should have. That was a century before I was born. Killian's expression shifted, not dramatically, nothing so obvious as shock or surprise, but something in the set of his jaw softened and his gaze settled on her with a weight that felt almost like recognition. Fenrir paced to the chamber door and turned back. His blue eyes caught the gray light from the window and his claws scraped against stone, a motion that was not aggression, it was preparation. It was the war beast sensing the approach of war and refusing to be idle. The border cannot be held by a divided command. Killian's voice was low. The political situation inside these walls has bought us time, but it has bought us nothing if the Eastern Front breaks. He moved toward her, stopped 3 paces away, close enough that she could see the faint scars on his hands, the lines of exhaustion around his eyes. I am not asking you to defer to me. Each word was deliberate, chosen. I am asking you to fight beside me. The chamber seemed to hold its breath. Outside, boots passed on the stone corridor, dispatch riders, guards, the sound of a palace mobilizing for war. Era looked at him. She thought of the antechamber, the night of the ceremony, when he had told her she had until dawn to decide what she intended to do. She thought of the 10 days at the same table, the silent agreements, the disagreements resolved without conquest. She thought of the old boundary stones on the map, and the army moving toward them through the gray morning light. Yes, she said. The word landed between them like a stone dropped in still water. The War Council chamber had transformed into something between a military command and a fever dream. Maps covered every surface, pinned and weighted with daggers at the corners. Supply ledgers lay open beside daggers and half-eaten meals. The armory's clangor filtered through the stone walls, punctuated by the tramp of boots in the corridor beyond. Ara worked without being told where to begin. She took the research. Elric brought scroll after scroll, dust-covered and brittle, and she spread them across the secondary table she'd claimed 10 days ago. The founding documents of the Blood Moon Compact, the old boundary treaties, the Ashenmaw clan's original grievances, recorded in a language that predated the current pack hierarchy by 3 centuries. Killian took the military. He summoned pack commanders, issued mobilization orders, coordinated with the quartermaster on grain and fodder. His voice carried through the chamber, low and certain, as he divided the eastern force into defensive sectors. The wolf-born warriors filed in and out, some shooting Ara glances that lingered, others refusing to look at her at all. They did not discuss who would do what. It simply happened, each moving to the domain where their knowledge held strongest. On the second day, Elric produced the founding scroll. The parchment was heavier than Ara expected. The seal cracked and repressed so many times the wax had become layered history. 2 junior priests witnessed as Elric unrolled it across the council table, revealing the genealogical record of the primordial line, witnessed and countersigned by the first wolves themselves. The petition is answered, Elric announced, his aged voice carrying the weight of finality. The genealogical review is concluded. The heir of the primordial line is recognized. Seraphina stood in the doorway of the grand hall, her white gown immaculate, her face a mask of controlled acceptance. She had known, Aura realized. She had known the moment Fenrir bowed. She did not argue, she did not protest. She inclined her head slightly acknowledgement, not surrender, and requested a private audience. They met in the antechamber, the same space where Killian had once told Aura she had until dawn to decide her future. Seraphina's ice-blue eyes studied Aura with an expression that was neither hostile nor warm. "You are a political reality now," Seraphina said. Her voice carried no apology, there would be none, and Aura did not expect it. "I am the daughter of Councilman Vinus. I have knowledge of the noble houses, their debts, their ambitions, their weaknesses." Aura waited. "I am offering this knowledge as a professional transaction." Seraphina's chin lifted slightly, not capitulation. "I will advise you on noble relations. I will not obstruct governance."
These are my terms.
Ara considered the woman before her proud, calculating, ambitious in ways Ara understood without needing them explained. She nodded once, agreed. They did not shake hands. That would have implied warmth they did not share. Instead, Seraphina turned and left, her footsteps precise and measured, her back straight. The third day brought Margot. The head servant appeared in the armory without announcement, her sturdy frame filling the doorway. She carried a traveling provision satchel leather worn soft by decades of use, packed tight and sealed with cord.
This is for you.
Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact, the same provisions I pack for every noble departure. She set it on the table before Ara and turned to leave. At the threshold, she paused. "You were never meant to be invisible." The words came out rough, almost unwilling. Neither was I. Then she was gone, leaving only the smell of kitchen smoke and the weight of something that might have been regret. That evening, Elric performed the rite in the courtyard. Fenrir stood motionless as the old priest spoke the binding words, his ancient voice weaving the magic that had once belonged solely to the primordial line. The ritual extended Fenrir's service, joint now, shared between Ara and Killian for the duration of the campaign. Fenrir accepted this with the stillness of a creature who had waited centuries for exactly this. The night before departure, Ara found herself at a window, not the kitchen slit she had once pressed her face to, hiding from passing guards. This was higher, the palace wall, looking down at the same alley where she had once hauled ash and scrubbed flagstones, and made herself small enough to survive. From here, the view was not triumphant. It was simply clear. Chapter 3: Fire at the Rift. The rift opened before her like a wound in the world. Ara had studied the maps until the ink had burned into her memory. The ridgeline, the tree break, the creek bed that became a muddy death trap in spring. But maps did not capture the smell of it. Pine sap and iron, frost and something older, something that tasted like the moment before a howl. 3,000 stood in the far tree line, silent, waiting. She did not freeze. That surprised her more than the army. Fenrir moved forward, his massive black form cutting through the early morning mist. The ground crunched beneath his weight, and where he passed, the frost turned to dark water. The eastern ranks stirred, a ripple of movement, of whispered words. These wolves had grown up on the same legends that filled the Blood Moon's grand halls. They knew what Fenrir meant. Killian's horse stepped beside hers. He did not look at her. His gold eyes remained fixed on the distant force, his jaw set in the hard line she had come to recognize as both warning and readiness. They rode forward to the Parley Point, a bare stretch of frozen earth, neutral ground, military custom. 2 leaders before 2 armies. The Eastern force sent 1 representative. She was ancient, her fur silver gray, her posture straight despite the weight of what looked like centuries. She carried a staff crowned with the old clan's sigil, a wolf devoured by flames, the Ashenmaw mark. She spoke to Ara directly. The old tongue rolled off her tongue like water over stone, and Ara felt the words land in her chest before her mind could translate them. Covenant terms, broken promises, land taken, honors denied, the primordial line's failure to protect what fell under its authority. Ara had learned the old tongue in 4 days. Elric had drilled her until her throat ached, until the words stopped feeling foreign and started feeling like something older than language itself. She responded. Her voice was imperfect, the consonants rougher than the elders', the cadence less smooth, but the words were correct. She acknowledged the covenant. She named the failures, specific ones, pulled from Elric's documents, from the founding texts that had taken the old priest a lifetime to interpret. She offered formal recognition of the Eastern clan as protected territory under the primordial line's authority. A diplomatic move. One Killian had not anticipated. He did not interrupt. The elder listened, her expression did not change. When Ara finished, the silence stretched. Then the elder shook her head. Words. Her voice carried across the frozen ground. The old way requires proof of nature, wolf against wolf. Contested trial. Ara understood before Elric's lessons finished translating in her mind. The ancient resolution mechanism, written in the founding text, confirmed by the old priest himself, a challenge that could not be refused without surrender. She looked at Killian. He met her gaze, and something passed between them that did not need words.
The eastern force relaxed their advanced posture. A circle formed in the frosted clearing 30 paces across.
The champion emerged from the Ashenmal lines. He was enormous. Fully shifted, he stood taller than a warhorse, his fur the color of ash, his eyes burning with the same cold fire as the clan's sigil. He represented 3,000 soldiers. He represented a century of grievances. Ara stepped forward. The primordial wolf rose in her like a tide. Silver-white fur erupted across her skin, the runes etched in her armor blazing to life. Her bones shifted. Her senses exploded outward, every scent, every sound, every breath of wind against fur. The fight was not quick, but it was decisive. The Ashenmal champion yielded first belly to the ground, throat exposed, the universal submission of one wolf to another. The sound that followed was not a howl but a chorus, 3,000 voices, dropping to the frost. They knelt, not to Killian, to Ara. Then she looked toward Killian, and the eastern force shifted, kneeling now to both of them together. A united line, a new order made flesh. The blood on the frost-white ground caught the dawn light. Ara stood in her primordial wolf's silver-white fur, Fenrir at her shoulder, Killian watching from the parley line. It looked like the ending of something. The wind shifted. Somewhere in the far distance beyond the tree line, a horn sounded. A different tone, a different army. It was not the ending.
The fires burned low against the cold. Era sat outside her tent, her primordial form dissolved back into human skin, though the runes still pulsed faintly beneath her wrists like a second heartbeat. Fenrir lay beside her, his massive body radiating heat that fought against the frozen ground. The riders had come 3 hours after the Eastern clan's surrender. A second force, smaller than the first, moving under a different sigil, the Black Tide Crest, an Eastern house that had broken from the main clan generations ago. They had been sighted less than a day's ride from the capital. The main army's departure route had been predictable. Someone had made sure the Black Tide knew exactly when the Eastern ranks would be far from home. Inside, the words settled in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Someone inside the palace had sent word. Someone who knew the army's movements, who understood that the ceremony would pull forces to the rift, who had calculated that the capital would be vulnerable. Killian had assembled his commanders behind closed tent flaps. She had heard fragments through the canvas, the sharp cadence of his voice, the low rumble of response. The analysis was simple. If the Black Tide force reached the palace before the main army could redirect, they would find the council exposed. The lords who had argued against her, the servants who had served her ash buckets, Seraphina, with her ice-blue eyes and her genealogical petitions, Elric, with his ancient scrolls, Margot, who had tightened Ara's sash until it bit into her ribs. All of them there because she had risen. She had won the trial. She had bent the Eastern clan to recognition. And someone had used that moment, the moment of her triumph, to strike at what she was meant to protect. The stars above were extraordinary, clear and cold and indifferent. She had spent 20 years invisible in the palace, and now every person in it was visible to her, every life a weight she could not set down. Killian found her an hour later. He did not speak immediately. He sat beside her on the frozen ground, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The cold seeped through her armor, through the thin fabric of her tunic. She did not move away. "The second force is moving because they believe we will not make it back in time," he said. His voice was low, stripped of ceremony. "Let's prove them wrong." It was not comfort. It was not reassurance. It was the simple statement of a partner who understood that she did not need to be told the wound would heal. She needed to be told what came next. Fenrir lifted his massive head, his blue eyes fixed on the northern horizon, toward the capital, toward the palace, toward the danger that had found its shape because of her. He held the gaze until she stood. The decision came to her at dawn. Ira stood on the ridgeline, watching the eastern ridge fall away behind them, unsecured, vulnerable, a gap in their coverage that any competent commander would exploit. She could feel Killian watching her from across the camp, his gold eyes tracking her as she worked through the calculus of risk. She would not divide the army. We move north, she said when the War Council assembled. All of us, full speed toward the capital. Councilman Marin objected. The Eastern Ridge cannot be held if the capital falls. She met his gaze. We leave it open. They will not expect that. Killian studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. The Eastern Ridge is empty ground. The capital is everything. The Eastern Elder, still bound by the Covenant's recognition, spoke up. My clan's fastest riders will scout ahead. An hour later they moved. The march brutalized them. A day and a half of pushing horses and wolves past exhaustion, of cold meals eaten in the saddle, of strategic silence between Ara and Killian as they rode side by side. There was nothing left to plan. Everything had been discussed, rediscussed, set into motion. What remained was the simple presence of each other, the weight of the bond no longer new, no longer tentative, but settled like something that had always existed. They reached the capital's outer gates at dusk. The secondary force had already breached the northern wall. Smoke rose from the inner districts, but Fenrir had preceded them all.
The war beast hit the black-tide vanguard like a force of nature, blue eyes blazing, claws tearing through steel and bone, the primordial authority of the founding covenant made manifest in flesh. Wolves who had planned for human politics and military formations found themselves facing something their commanders had never accounted for, the old magic itself choosing a side. The secondary force broke on contact. Ara hit the capital gates in full primordial form, silver white and luminous against the dying light, runes blazing across her fur like living fire. The remaining black-tide elements encountered what no strategy could have prepared them for, the force of ancient blood walking among them. The battle ended before Killian's main army finished pouring through the gates. The final confrontation came in the Grand Hall's doorway. Ara stood there, massive and terrible, her pale blue eyes fixed on the secondary force's commander. He was older than she expected, gray at his temples, a scar running down his jaw. He had believed the primordial line was a myth. He looked at her for 10 full seconds, then he set down his weapon. The war ended not in flames, but in silence. Old magic settled like dust after a storm. The ancestral mural overhead continued its ancient watch. Killian entered the Grand Hall and found her already there. They faced the dais together, the same dais where everything had begun. Neither spoke for a long moment. Then he removed the ceremonial circlet from his own head and held it between them.
Not placing it on her, offering it, as he had once offered the blade. We build something new, he said. Ara took it. She did not put it on her head. She placed it on the ceremonial table. Together, she said, or not at all. Fenrir moved between them and lay down on the cold stone, blue eyes closing. The bond between all three of them settled into its final shape. Not master and beast, not king and subject, not ancient magic and modern politics. Something new, something that had not existed before. The morning of the dual coronation arrived clear and cold. Ara stood at the Grand Hall's entrance, waiting for the doors to open. 6 months of preparation had led to this moment. The rearrangement of the dais, the commission of the new mural panel, the careful negotiations with every house. Everything was in place. The doors swung inward. She walked the length of the hall alone, as tradition demanded. The two thrones waited on the dais, side by side, neither higher than the other. Morning light streamed through the high windows, catching the silver threads in Killian's ceremonial blacks as he took his place on the left throne. Elric stood between the thrones, ancient and trembling but steady of voice. Alara Primoris, he intoned as she ascended the dais, first daughter of the primordial line, sovereign queen of the Blood Moon realm. She knelt before him. The crown was heavier than she expected. When he placed it on her head, he sank to one knee himself, his clouded eyes closing. She caught the whisper of old words, the original blessing, spoken to a living recipient for the first time in a millennium. When he rose, she stood and turned to face the assembly. Every house was present. The Eastern clan's elder occupied the premier position that Seraphina once held. Seraphina herself sat in the second council tier, her chin raised, her expression one of professional acceptance. She had proven invaluable as noble relations advisor over the past 6 months. The new order had room for her skills. Margot watched from the service corridor, the same corridor where Ara had once carried an amphora of wine. The head servant's face had lost its procedural blankness. She was witnessing. Nothing more and nothing less. That was enough. Fenrir lay on the dais between the two thrones, massive and ancient and entirely at peace. The ceremony continued. Killian received his crown with the same formal words, his gold eyes finding Ara's across the space between them. When it ended, the hall buzzed with the low murmur of gathered nobles. Ara raised her hand. The Omega designation is abolished, she said, her voice carrying through the hall. Effective immediately. Every person within our territories will carry a name and recognized status. No one will be assigned invisibility as a birthright. The reaction rippled through the assembly. Relief, resistance, wonder, the cautious beginnings of belief. She had expected this. She had planned for this. She would implement it regardless. Killian watched her from his throne. The expression on his face was not the face of a king observing a subordinate. It was the face of a person who had chosen with absolute clarity, watching that choice prove itself right. The celebration moved to the outer courtyard. The hall emptied. Aura remained. She stood at the dais' edge, looking down at the spot where the amphora had shattered 6 months ago. The stone had been repaired. The wine stain was gone. But she knew exactly where it had been. Fenrir padded over and pressed his enormous head against her hip. She placed her palm, the one with the faint scar from the ritual blade, on the bridge of his head. No flood of memory, no awakening, just the warm, steady hum of connection, old magic recognizing that it was exactly where it belonged. She looked up at the ancestral mural overhead, at the new addition, at herself, silver white and luminous, painted into the history of a world that once could not see her. She was seen now. She saw herself. That, finally, was enough.